Good evening, everybody. Really what we're going to talk about tonight, and thanks for joining us, is RMS Egypt. I'll go through some details on that, but I was chatting with someone the other day and they were asking, well, how did you get qualified to do 120 plus meter diving? Well, the answer to that, there wasn't a qualification to it, but what I'm going to do is I've dropped in a quick slide to just introduce myself and my background as to how we built up to doing this type of diving before we get into the Egypt. It's only because I was asked the other day, what was your background? How did you get to do 120, 150 meter type diving? So we'll make a kick off now, check everything's working. Okay. So I really want to do is just do a quick intro to myself. That's Nick Jewson. I've been in BSAC a few too many years now to remember, but over 40 years now. Currently BSAC Technical Instructor Trainer at AMG level for open circuit and closed circuit. But my history was, I came from INTD. I did INTD open circuit training in the UK, and then my INTD rebreather training was all done over in the USA, over in Florida with Tom Mount. Now, I got my AMG in the early 1990s for open circuit. Did my cislunar training over in the States in 1996, and then an inspiration diver. And then I did my instructor's tickets again over in the States for over a few weeks with my Mod 3 on the level cislunar Mark 5 and on the inspiration. These were both in 1999. I was over there doing that. I was then also first diver in the UK to buy a production rebreather that was sold into the recreational market, and that was the cislunar Mark 5. I purchased that in 1996, which, according to my maths, I've now been, for my age, been diving rebreathers or CCRs for over 24 years now. I was one of the founder members of BSAC Technical Group, been part of Technical Group for over 20 years now, and held different roles within the Technical Group as head Technical Group leader, and up until last year I was BSAC Chief Technical Examiner. I've been involved with writing virtually all, up to date, all of the BSAC technical courses. So a little bit of background around that diving, plus I've done a large number of other expeditions, deep expeditions, either organising or being a member of. So that is really my background to doing 120 metre type diving. But I was lucky. My personal interest has always been deep wreck diving and videoing them, but I'm lucky my wife shares the same passion. Well, a few years ago, she set a world record at that time for the deepest woman CCR wreck diver, 146 metres for a total dive time of about 6.5 hours. That was back a few years ago now. That was on one of Mike's trips doing the Victoria, sorry. So yeah, that was my background. So enough of that. Now what we're going to go on is talk about what you guys joined us for tonight. That's talking about the Egypt. We're going to look where the location of the wreck, why dive the Egypt, how do we dive the Egypt, then a video of the Egypt. And we'll talk a little bit some of the history, why we looked at the Egypt in the first place. So what was the RMS Egypt, Royal Mail Ship Egypt? She was a P&O liner. Unfortunately, the age of it, there's no good new photographs of her, so it's a case of finding what we could. She was built up in Greenock. Not that massive a vessel. She was nearly 8,000 tons, about 500 feet long, about 54 feet wide, draft about 24 feet. It was a reasonable speed. For her age, she could do just on 18 knots under the speed trials, so she wasn't a slow vessel. She was launched Saturday the 15th of May in 1897. Unfortunately, she sank 20th of May in 1922, about 7 o'clock in the evening, but then we'll give a lot more details around that. So, P&O Egypt. She was one of a class of 5 identical steamships. The first one off the line was the India, so they tended to call the class the India class, but she was one of 5 identical ships that were built. The fate of the 5 other ships in the class were, the India was torpedoed in Norway, the China became a hospital ship up in Scapa, the Arabia was torpedoed over in Greece, and the Persia, not the Persia we probably all know and love down the south coast, but this Persia was torpedoed and sunk out near Crete. So with the Egypt, all of that class of vessels have now either been lost or through accidents such as the Egypt or torpedoed. The one we have very little history on was the China, which became a hospital ship and was in Scapa Flow, moored in Scapa Flow for quite a long while. For all the searching, we can't find any history of what happened to the China after her time as a hospital ship. But again, no good photographs at the time. But she was a first-class liner, or she had the capability of carrying first-class passengers, so was fairly well laid out, fairly luxurious in its day for first class. She could carry up to 320 passengers and up to in first class, and about 160 passengers in second class, plus cargo and mail. Got no photographs of what the second class would be like, but I doubt it would be anything like first. So, last voyage of the Egypt, what actually happened to her? On 19th of May 1922, she left London Tilbury, heading for Marseille, then on to Bombay. She was actually sailing to Bombay, was the ultimate destination. But they're going through Marseille on the way. They only left London with 44 passengers, but with nearly 300 crew on board. Most of the other passengers were going to board in Marseille to avoid the often rough weather coming down through the Bay of Biscay. And that comment will come back in a little bit later on when we talk about the salvage of it. Going down to the Bay of Biscay is well renowned for not the best of the weather. So on the evening of May the 20th, around Ushant, the Egypt entered a very thick fog bank. So Egypt reduced speed, and this is where details are a little bit sketchy. Some of the witness reports said that she had stopped engines, others said she'd reduced speed considerably. They said she was doing around 5 knots, others say she'd actually stopped and was stationary, but that we'll never know completely. That just gives a slight map. We'll talk about that map slightly in more detail in a minute. Another steamship siren could be heard approaching them through the fog, but it was too dense to see it. It was later found out this was the French steamship, the Seine, of 1,383 tons. The problem was the Seine had been built with strengthened bowels to deal with Baltic ice, because the runs it used to in the winter. So it was, I won't say it had an icebreaker on the front of it, but it was a fairly reinforced bow to the Seine. But around 7 o'clock on the evening of the 20th, the Seine appeared out of the fog on the port side of the Egypt. Witnesses say travelling very fast. In the various inquests afterwards, the captain of the Seine was refusing that, saying no, he was going very slowly. But it took 15 seconds from when they saw it in the fog before it hit the liner on the port side. And this is where its strengthened bow did most of the damage. It basically ripped the side out of the Egypt, and the Egypt sank within 20 minutes. But unfortunately, due to a very severe list to the port-hand side, a number of the lifeboats could not be launched. They were stuck in the davits. They could not be moved. Excuse me, folks. I've just had a message come up from someone wanting to annotate. Decline that. Don't know who that is. Sorry about that, guys. Just had a message. I don't know if you guys saw it pinged up in the middle of my screen. Okay, so basically, from being hit to sunk took 20 minutes. 15 passengers, 71 of the crew were lost with the ship. One person died later in hospital. The captain remained at his post to the last and was picked up in the water by one of the boats. Now, to give Seine some credit here, even in the thick fog with the Egypt now sinking, the Seine managed to turn back round and came back and spent many hours rescuing survivors from the Egypt, because other vessels, they put radio calls out. The actual radio operator died on the Egypt. He stayed at his post until she suddenly flipped over and sank. So the message had got out to various points that she had been hit and was sinking, but it was only the Seine who was really in the area to be able to offer assistance, even in the thick fog. So, as I said, in thick fog, back in those days, they didn't have GPS to know exactly where they were. So finding the wreck was not the easiest of tasks. So it took over 5 years, from 23 to 28, various companies conducted searches for the wreck of the Egypt, but none of them found her. they were normally searching for it by just dragging a steel cable between two vessels, hoping it was going to snag. But as you can imagine, there's quite a few rocks and what have you on the seabed, so a lot of the time they were snagging large rocks and they weren't the wreck they were looking for. So this went on for about 5 years. At the end of that, in June 1929, an Italian company took up the search. They spent another 15 months searching for the wreck, and they finally located the wreck. They hit the top of the wreck at about 120, 122, and the actual seabed depth was about 130 meters it was quite a large vessel for its day, but it was only a very large trawler in effect. There's a photograph of her there on the right-hand side. So they used this salvage vessel to go and find it. All they were doing was dragging a cable between two boats till it snagged. So you might ask, well, how did they identify it as a wreck rather than just a large rock? And how did they identify it as being the Egypt? So when they found it, it was an even keel with mast and funnel still standing on a smooth seabed. Well, how would they know this? They used something called the patent diving suit. We'll see some photographs of that in a minute. Mark, I don't know why I keep getting messages up requesting to annotate the shared content. I'm declining them at the moment, mate. So folks, I don't know this video conference system, but I keep getting these messages keep pinging up, Mark. So I don't know if that's something you could look into.
Okay, it's not showing on the rest of the presentation for people watching.
Okay, mate, that's fine. I'll ignore them then. Okay, so she was identified using a patent diving suit, which was lowered by a winch until it was expected to be above the wreck. So this was the patent diving suit, a large tube with some windows in that the guy was put in, the lid was bolted on, and he was lowered over the wreck with no control at all. So he was just, as an observation chamber, he was lowered down, he could look out little windows around the top port of it. Now, inside that, there was a diver. He had a air regeneration apparatus, as they called it. We would know it as a very early form of rebreather. The canister had an absorbent material in there. He had oxygen bottles inside the observation chamber, and he had a telephone system. The cable lowered him down, also ran a telephone line back up to his crew on the surface of the boat. So he could talk to the crew, tell him what he was seeing, and they could then reposition him, which you can imagine hanging nearly 400 feet down on a cable with a tide running would be fairly difficult, but he could speak to the surface. But if you notice there, he was wearing thick coats, boots and what have you. The chambers leaked a little bit. It was not unknown for them to get part way down and have to haul them back up again, take the observation windows out, reseal them, put the window back in and put them back down again. They were not made to the precision that we'd be used to today. But this is how he observed it. He was in that chamber, lowered down, looking out through the windows. They tried using underwater lights at one point, but they found they were more of a hazard to the diver because water and electricity doesn't mix well today. In those days, they were forever getting shorts of the lights and what have you. So in the end, they purely relied on normal sunlight or light for them to be able to view the wreck or see where they were, which anyone who's done any of the deep diving will know wherever you are, apart from out in the Med Navy, there's not that much light gets down to that depth. So it was a hard piece of work for him. Yes. So there's normal to have some leaks. The driver would wear a coat and boots to stay dry. So after they found it, they put this guy down in the observation chamber, and he identified, yes, there was a very large wreck down there, and from what he could see in a static chamber, he couldn't move around. They thought it to be the Egypt, but as you can imagine, there've been so many people looking for the Egypt for so long, there was a certain amount of skepticism as if they had found the Egypt. So we'll look a little bit more on what they started to use. This was back in the 20s. They did have these type of articulated suits, dive suits, which the Italian company had used for working on and salvaging on other vessels. And the intention was they were going to use this and not the observation chamber we saw the photograph earlier, which would have made more sense because the diver could move, can use the grips on the arms, whatever, to move things around. But there was a slight problem with them. He'd be lowered down to the wreck on a surface winch, and he would have some ability to work on the wreck in that style of suit. But when the current was running, which in the Bay of Biscay there are often some fairly good tides, the arms on the suit acted as rudders and would turn the suit in line with the current. So basically, one, his observation windows would only look in one direction, and two, he couldn't move around. So they decided that they didn't even try to put this articulated suit in on the Egypt. They decided it was going to be a waste of time and too difficult, because if he got moved in the current, there's too many points he could snag on in the wreck. So they didn't actually put the articulated suits down onto the RMS Egypt wreck. So they used the painted observation chamber, gave the diver, as I mentioned earlier, ability to view in all directions and was not turned or rotated by the current. So all this skepticism about, oh, have you found the Egypt? Because Bay of Biscay, there'd be a lot of wrecks have gone down in there. So there was some skepticism. So they've got to prove they'd found the Egypt. So they made a decision, they're going to recover the captain's safe. Sounds a nice, easy decision to make, but finding it probably difficult, you'd have thought. But using the observation diver suspended over the wreck, he was then talking via the telephone to a large grab that was lowered from the wreck. And they used that to rip away roofs, doors and panels until they managed to recover the captain's safe. Now, if you look at this photograph, you can see the special grabs on the safe. As the safe came out of the water, it was held quite a way up in the grabs. It was slowly slipping down and down. So I think they said when it actually got it winched over onto the boat so it couldn't go anywhere, there was about an inch of contact between the tips of the jaws of the grapple and the safe. So they were very close to having lost the safe after having found it and recovered it. Artigo then steamed into Brest, where the safe was opened with the British consul present. Basically, the salvagers needed some official endorsement that they had actually found the Egypt. So the British consul came along. When they opened the safe, inside it they found Foreign Office correspondence which had been sent by the Egypt. So this was formally establishing this was the identity of the wreck as the Egypt. And it was just by recovering that safe. Because as you can imagine, this process went on for a long while ago, looking for the wreck, trying to salvage it. They had a number of people investing money in them to fund the salvage operation. So this was a critical point to make sure the funding was still going to be available and it wasn't they're just going to salvage some other merchantman that was in there. So this identified it was the wreck of the Egypt. So where is the liner RMS Egypt? That is the location of the Egypt, and the location took a long while to find, but she's now a known location, and it's about 30 miles from the port to the wreck, and it's well out into the Bay of Biscay, and the seabed chart there, I think was about 118 metres it was giving for the seabed there, so plus 8-10 metres on top of that, give you some idea of the depth of the water the Egypt was lying in. So the start of the salvage on the Egypt, because there is a story alongside the Egypt on the disasters of the salvage around the Egypt. So the start of the salvage operation was over a period of good weather. So when they first found the wreck and identified it, they had 2 weeks of good weather. Now, if you imagine the ship was sitting upright, the bullion locker or bullion hold is right at the bottom of the vessel. So to salvage her, they had to use explosive to cut decking and work all the way down through from the top of the ship right the way down, not quite to the keel, but to the top of the bullion room, which was virtually in contact with the keel. For the first 2 weeks, they made good progress with the salvage and they started to get their systems working because they had never salvaged a wreck in this depth of water before. The weather was one of the longest or the largest issues they suffered with. So as an average, every 21 days, they'd only get 7 days they could get above the wreck of the Egypt because of weather. So you can imagine why this took so long, one, to find it, and we'll look at the dates of how long it took to salvage it, because they only get about 7 days work in 21. And this was them working every day they possibly could. After the first 2 weeks, the weather had then changed, and that time of year, this heralded the end of the effective working season above the Egypt, because the winter storm started to come through at that time. But obviously they're a salvage company. They only make money by undertaking salvage contracts. So this time, even though they're an Italian company who'd come round to work out of Brest, they didn't lay the ship up because they'd picked up a new salvage contract that was possible to work on over the winter weather, as in much shallower water. They'd secured a contract to remove a 1970, sunk in 1917, an American munitions ship, the Florence H. And it had sunk due to a fire in only 50, 60 feet of water, but it was also classified as a danger to shipping because it was full of munitions at the time, and it was only fairly shallow. So they picked up the contract to go and work on this, which meant they could keep working over the winter when the weather wouldn't let them get out on the Egypt. Unfortunately, it was full of old munitions that could have been rendered inert or not by the time in the water. So they were very cautious to start with. The divers went down, they attached the first explosive charges and steamed well clear of the wreck. They believed by about a mile before setting off the first charges. There were no secondary explosions, which they were all quite relieved by. So over the next days, they set more charges, but each time they didn't bother to steam quite as far away, because obviously steaming a mile away and coming back was time wasted they didn't want to lose. So they were now under the impression, after a few days of setting off large explosive charges, cutting the vessel up, the cargo of munitions were inert, or so they had nothing to fear, so they believed. So you can all probably guess what's going to happen next. On the 7th of December 1930, they are now only steaming about 100 yards away from the wreck site before they set off the charges. And up until now, that hadn't been a problem for them. But on the 7th, the task was to remove the stern section of the wreck. But on firing the set charges, there was a massive explosion, and this time the Florence H cargo of old munitions did explode. And unfortunately, the shockwave, there was no photographs, but this artist's drawing was the effect on the salvage vessel. It was absolutely destroyed by the shockwave and the gas bubble that came up from the explosive, not of theirs, but all of the munitions that were on the wreck detonated at that point. So unfortunately, it killed everybody on there. The explosion, well, not nearly everybody on there, the explosion was heard on the mainland nearly 30 miles away. And when the smoke cleared, the Altoga had gone, unfortunately, with most of her crew. For the Egypt salvage of next year, they had to fit out a replacement ship, which they were going to call Category 2, and they had to start with a new team, as most had been lost in the explosion on the Florence H. In the end, they dropped the 2. They just called her the Artigo again, because they believed it'd be bad luck to call it number 2 in that range. So they didn't, they just called her the Artigo. So they had to start the next year. They knew where the wreck was. They put some very large reinforced buoys above the wreck over the winter so they wouldn't have to spend the time finding it. So the next year, they then started using the new salvage vessel. But the thing was, they had to use this salvage vessel to salvage the previous vessel, because they had a lot of bespoke salvage equipment, special winches and everything on there, which they needed for the new vessel. So they had to salvage their old vessel before they could really start the next season of salvaging on the Egypt. So again, the diver was suspended with a telephone connection, and the diver would then direct the placing of explosive charges. He couldn't do them because he didn't have one of the articulated suits. So you can now imagine in 400 feet of water, there's that observation chamber being held on a cable from the boat, from the salvage vessel. The salvage vessel did have 4 anchors out, so it could keep itself fairly in position above the wreck. They had to winch in various anchor cable lengths to position the vessel based on what the observation diver said. You can imagine any tide running, anything like that, he'd probably be swinging around a little bit with the boat moving on the surface. And he was having to tell the surface crew who are lowering explosive charges on a winch where about to position explosive charges. Very difficult job to get the charges where they wanted first time. It could take hours to get the charges where they were needed. So he'd then be winched back up again. Obviously, they'd learnt. They'd winch him back up, then the charges would be detonated, and then they'd have to leave it a while for the sediment that's been stirred up. They'd winch the diver back down again. And this process went on for many, many months, in fact, a year or so, before they could get down through all the charges through the decks to get to the strong room. But not only did they have to use the explosive to cut the decks, you'll see in later photographs, they have a large grapple, which they have to lower down. The guy in the observation chamber has to then tell them where to position the grapple to get hold of all the old steel from the decks and what have you, to lift it clear of the wreck and then dump the steel, if it was no salvage value, clear of the wreck so they could then work their way down through the decks. So it's not a fast or precision task. And the controlling the grab, they said, was the hardest piece, because the size of the grab, any current would be swinging the grab away from where the diver wanted it. You can imagine it must have been fairly frustration for the diver in the chamber talking via telephone to the guys on the surface, who are then having to winch in each one of 4 anchors or let the anchor cables out to position the vessel where they wanted the grab. But that's how they worked it. This video, or this shot here, is the artist's impression of the Egypt well into the Salvage. The little red circle is just showing the guy being hung in his observation chamber and showing the grapple there that he was having to position by the telephone, tell them where to put it to drop it down to grab on the steel and then rip the steel away from the decking so they could slowly work their way down to the very bottom. And that impression you're seeing in the bottom of the hole lower down, that was in theory the bullion room, but they had to work their way down through all the other decks. Now, us as divers find this a bit sacrilege, but every time they stopped overnight, the next day they'd come back, where they'd ripped all those decks away. In the background you can see, they were all the cabins. So all the articles that are in the cabins, all the beds, everything like this, used to slide out from those decks where they'd weakened them when they'd ripped them out. And all of this would be falling down and covering up the top of the bullion room again. So the next day they had to be moving all the contents of the cabins that slid out overnight off of the bullion room before they could start again. And that's assuming they could get back out to dive the next day. If it's 2 or 3 days or 5 days or 10 days before they get back out there because of storms, the whole of the bullion room will be completely covered with debris, with deck plating. The walls of the cabins, as they'd ripped through them, all came down. So it was a very, very long and hard process, is the way I'd describe it. There are 2 books that are available you can buy. One is the Egypt Gold and another one called 70 Fathoms. Both of them are written by a journalist who was actually on board the salvage vessel for the period that he's actually part of the crew for about 4 years on the salvage vessel. So all of this was his first-hand writing. He was putting back to the newspaper, because he was a newspaper journalist, and then when he's written these 2 books. They're difficult to get hold of, but they do make an interesting read of what they used to do on deep salvage diving in the early days. Okay, the initial salvage continued to about 1935. By this time, they got about, they believed, 98% of the contents of the strong room had been recovered. The problem was they had declared to Lloyd's, because Lloyd's of London were the insurers for the Egypt's cargo, they hadn't declared everything that had been put in the bullion room. There was quite a few other high-value personal jewels, gems, and other bullion that other people had put into the bullion room. So when they say they recovered 98%, they recovered 98% of what Lloyd's was liable for, and Lloyd's had paid out against for what the cargo was. At the time of sinking, the cargo was worth about just over £1 million at the time. In 1987, they salvaged the remaining part of the cargo. So 87, they went with saturation divers. They put normal divers down, and they recovered what they believe was the remaining part of the Bullion, which they got another 150 kilos of silver, 744 gold sovereigns, and gold bars weighing about 3 kilos. So in 87, just that small element was valued at over £2 million. So you might now start to get a little bit of a reason, because one of my points at the very beginning, we're going to cover why dive the Egypt. A little bit tongue-in-cheek there, but in 87, they used saturation diving, and they did recover quite a lot more. But any of you who've seen a gold sovereign, they're not the largest thing in the world. And I got to know one of the salvage divers who'd been involved with that saturation operation, and he gave me some information which made the Egypt an interesting target. The belief was that when they were grappling the sovereigns in particular, so there was a lot of sovereigns on there. When she sank, had over 5 tons of gold and 10 tons of silver on board. But when they were grappling a lot of sovereigns, they were obviously loose. They were dropping through the grapple, and they even had a second grapple underneath to try and catch him that fell. But apparently there were quite a few sovereigns who were lost around the wreck. And the guys who dived it in 87 said, if you do get to dive it, look along any of the girders that have been bent out. You might be lucky and find a gold sovereign laying in the ripped out girders. Well, one of the reasons we looked at going diving it. So why dive it? Well, a little bit tongue in cheek. Yeah, of course, there was a history to it. And we knew that not all of the gold and silver and bullion had been recovered, even after the 87 expedition. There were still to be believed a number of gold bars. And one of the interesting things were they weren't all 1 kilo gold bars or the gold bars you're used to seeing on all the TV programs. There was quite a range, even some of the small, few ounce ingots they had on there as well. So there was quite a lot of gold and the sovereigns and silver. And there was a large number of the large bars, 1 kilos. There was a lot of the small ones in there. So the belief is there is still gold sovereigns and a number of smaller of the gold bars and some of this undeclared, as far as the insurance was concerned, bullion still left within the Egypt. So probably answered one of the questions, why dive the Egypt? Our first thing is I've been given a talk to by one of these guys saying, yeah, if you dive it, look out for the sovereigns. You may well find those spread around the wreck when it had been salvaged. But there are a number of reasons for it. It sounded like an interesting wreck. There was quite a bit of history around her because of the volume of bullion she was carrying. Even today, not all the gold has been found. And most importantly, the location of the wreck made planning an expedition from the UK to be logistically fairly straightforward. A number of the expeditions I've been on, I've done the things like Lusitania, where there was always problems with permits and what have you getting it. Mike's trip we've done out to the Victoria, getting permits to dive it. There's lots of issues. At the time, diving out from Brest on the Egypt, there was no permits or there was no political problem. So from that point of view, it made the rest of the logistics just straightforward. You don't have to worry with the politics side on it. So that was another reason. It was in 128 meters of water, so it was going to be a challenging wreck. It sounded interesting, and there was always the little chance that one of you might have come across a gold sovereign or something more, but we just didn't know. And as I said, there were no permits or permissions required to dive it at the time, but that was back in 2006. So whether that's changed, I've not looked back into it. We've thought about going back out to it, but the weather in the Bay of Biscay is so unpredictable. As you saw, 7 days out of 21, if you only go there for a week's trip, the likelihood of getting to dive every day would be sheer luck. But other than that, there was not the political issues you have on a number of other wrecks. So how do we dive the Egypt? Well, back then, people were not doing this type of diving. It was still quite new. It's not new because people have been doing it since early 90s on some of the deep wrecks. But it was planned and organised around a detailed project plan. Our team was made up of like-minded divers who were prepared to commit the effort and the time into the expedition and project plan. So I put the project plan together back in 2006. And the like-minded divers is one of the most important things you have to accept on these type of trips. You're not going to be a bottom diver every day. Well, you can't do 120-meter diving every day. So you rotate through the different roles. And these trips aren't cheap. We'll look at some of the logisticals in a minute. But what a project plan will cover is a complete raft of everything from insurance and expedition logistics, team equipment, getting the equipment out there, daily diving rota, daily roles, what the roles were. Just to list some, you have a dedicated dive marshal, you have surface support, you have cover boat crew, have standby divers, deep water support, shallow water support, a gas mixer to one person be responsible for gas mixing on a day, but not doing all of it, and then all the dive briefings. So there's a lot to be put together to make sure your project plan allows for the worst case scenario of an accident happening. And that's what all that lot's there is to back up if there's an accident happens. Everybody diving on it were on rebreathers, as you can imagine. Doing that on open circuit would be fairly logistical challenge to carry large enough cylinders to get any time down there. So dedicated support divers covered deep and shallow support roles, but some of them who came on the trip were never going to dive the wreck. They only wanted to be involved with the expedition, and their role was going to be just doing support diving roles every day. They were never scheduled to do the actual wreck. And that's what I mean by like-minded individuals, people who are committed to doing this. Because there's a long way to go watching all these guys doing the wreck and never getting to dive it yourself. You've got people who are on the surface standing by ready to go in. You have a non-diving manager and they do not dive at all on the day because they're there to govern and make sure everything goes smoothly. God forbid an accident takes place. And then you'd have to have a chase boat. The worst thing is if someone has a problem, bags off from the wreck, they don't make it back to the decompression station. The decompression station have got the deep water support divers stationed deep, ready for the divers to come back. They'll have shallow water support divers on there. So if you don't get back to the station, then you needed support to get to you. So you have to have a separate boat. So you can be in two places at the same time. One boat above the decompression station and one boat goes over to be able to drop lines. God forbid if they miss coming back to the shot and they missed it because they had a gas problem and they needed gas, you've got to get a boat over to them and to put drop lines in. And the drop lines we use for this don't have one cylinder on, they have two cylinders. One probably stayed about 35 meters on the bottom of the line, and another one on the same drop bottle system up at about 8 meters. So when you put those in, you had to lower them in gently. There'd be one bottle on the same line down at 30, 35, one up at about 8 meters, supported with a large buoy on the surface. So you had to be able to have a means of deploying that to divers that they didn't get back to the main dive vessel, so hence the need to having the chase boat. So how did we dive the Egypt? You had to have this detailed plan and everyone had to be 100% in support of it. To do that, we got the team together and did weekends diving as a team, practicing and running through a number of the support roles. So everybody knew and understood 100% what was expected of them in their roles for the day. And I'm not going to go through this, but you can see on this under definition of roles on the right-hand side, the dive marshal, that was just what was broken down for the dive marshal. And every role was broken down as to what they were doing, what they were responsible for, and everything else. Basically, we had a team of 10 people, 8 people who were dedicated to doing the bottom, but they would then rotate through the other roles. But 2 of the people were just doing support. But the deep support diver could be sat at 50, 60 meters waiting for the bottom divers to come up. That poor guy, a person, often end up with more decompression to do than some of the bottom divers because the period of time he'd be waiting for them all to come back at the 70, 65 meter mark before he'd break the lazy away with them on. So it needed full commitment for everybody that was on there to do this type of diving and safely. Hey, there is nothing to stop people putting a rebreather on the back, jumping off and going doing a 120 meter dive today with no support at all. God forbid anything goes wrong, they won't come back. So just a quick look at some of the logistics of it. Suitable vessel and dedicated safety boat, Safety cylinders to be carried by support divers staged on decompression stations and set up on multi-cylinder drop lines, with additional reserve cylinders staged on the dive vessel. We had 28 cylinders dedicated for safety use. This was not being carried by the bottom divers. This was just cylinders that were dedicated for use should we have a diver with a problem. In addition to that, each diver had their own personal cylinders for their own rebreather, plus their own 2 bailout cylinders, suit inflation cylinder, small backup oxygen cylinder. In a total, we had about, for 8 bottom divers, 85 cylinders on the expedition. We had modular decompression station with drinks bags and signaling DSMBs attached to the station for when everyone's either back or not back. I'm not going to go through that tonight, but you have all this on the modular decompression station. Now, the modular decompression station that we were using came from a design done by one of the early deep diving teams, Starfish Enterprises. And when we say it's modular, God forbid you had somebody else bag off from a wreck and couldn't get back to the decompression station. It was designed, you could disassemble one leg of it and tow that leg over to where you had divers who were off of the station. Hence, we called it modular. You could actually take it apart and separate it underwater and still leave an active decompression station for the rest of the team. You had to have compressors and gas boosters. Plus, we had 8 Js of oxygen and helium ready for doing the daily gas mixing after any of the dives. So that's a lot of equipment, a lot of logistics. Some you can hire locally, some you have to take with you. Getting all the team kit and personnel over to France. Some people actually left with the boat. We used, there's a guy called Freddie out of Falmouth. He had a big catamaran called Pamela P that a load of the guys met Fred in Falmouth, Fred Buckingham this was, got on board his boat with our equipment, and Fred transported them from Falmouth over. Other of us drove over with vans with equipment in to the location that we were staying at just outside Brest. So, yeah, there's a lot of logistics, but believe me, doing it in France is a lot easier than the logistics of going down to the Britannic. So, yeah, but it was achievable quite simply because it was only France. So, we're just going to now drop into have a look at the video. Now, this is one of the videos that was shot. It was on a dive. The maximum depth we got on this dive was about 124 meters, but we had a total in water time of about 355 minutes. And that was about late 20s, 30-minute bottom time at 124 meters. So 355 minutes was quite a hang in the water. On the video, look out at the very end of the video, you'll see divers on the decompression station. Some are taking a low PO2 break and making use of the drink station. When we say a low PO2 break, 6.5 hours, you're running high levels of CNS, so you put in breaks. Were called air breaks. We nowadays just call them a low PO2 break. You drop down to low PO2. In those days, the inspirations was fairly new, and you'll see the guys using the air brakes. They were literally going off to an open circuit gas to breathe that for a point in time. Don't worry, when you see them on the video, they're not bailing out. They're just breaking the PO2 by dropping that down onto a low oxygen content gas, just purely to give them a PO2 break. And again, I will apologise, a little bit hazy on the video. Back in 2006, they didn't really have digital. Most of this was shot on Super VHS, so it's not the clearest. As you can see on the video here, that's the sides of the hull where all the decking had been ripped off during the salvage and was fairly well depicted on that artist's impression of the salvage operation. So we're now in the area where all the decking had been ripped away, just leaving the sides of the vessel standing up. Those are into portholes, with just rows of portholes standing up in the air, which you'll see later on. Possibly not quite so politically correct today, but that was my buddy, also on Cislunar at the time. He loves shipping line pottery, so he was locating all these which had the P&O logo on them.